I'm Katie Villier from the Executive Board of the Institute for Global Education, and we are really fortunate because we've got a wonderful scholar and speaker tonight, and that is my dear friend Michaeleen Kelly. Dr. Kelly is a philosopher emerita from Aquinas College, where she still teaches, and along with a lot of other interesting places. And she has written a paper. She did a lot of research about this topic that for us at IGE is really important, and that is that there are logical reasons why there is no just war. And she's going to have a response from our friend John Koch from Holland, who works for the VA and is himself a veteran. And I think it'll be an interesting discussion. But please give your attention to Mickey's paper about war and some of the, the reasons that people give for war and for there not being war. So I'm going to introduce my friend Michaeleen.
Philosophers have been worrying about what counts as a just war for a century, for millennia. Confucius, Plato. And so I'm just going to give you the 5 conditions that philosophers in the late 20th and early 21st century have come up with. They will all sound familiar. They will all sound reasonable. There's 5 of them, I think. Okay. A just war has to have the following conditions. The overall costs must outweigh the overall benefits. From my point of view, stop right there. Nothing else needs to be said. Okay, the nature of the leader's intentions. These intentions have to be ethical. The probability that peace will ensue as a result of the combat. The fact that no other means could have been used other than military combat. And finally, that combat be used as a last resort. I think those conditions say a lot. But, as the pragmatic pacifist argues, given the carnage and tremendous suffering war brings about in its wake, as a matter of fact, these conditions can never be met. There can never be a just war that one that fulfills all those conditions. The costs will always outweigh the benefits. And according to Dwayne Cady, this is where this next idea comes from, the violent means by which peace is pursued can't logically or factually be considered as a separate state apart from the end. As Cady describes this relationship, the end subsumes the means. Cady concludes that both the general pursuit and everyday practices of positive peace need to replace the millennia-long pursuit of peace through war. In order to, the name of the paper is Just War Theory as Ideological and Combatant Role Confusion. So what I'm arguing for is that the theory, the just war theory, functions ideologically in our culture, and that's the cause of combatant role confusion. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what it means to hold a belief ideologically. And by the time we leave here, I'm going to talk about maybe 4 different versions of it. You may never want to hear that word again, ideological. But you'll know how to pronounce it. Okay, so I want to start with Jürgen Habermas's theory of communicative action to figure out what's the standing of just war theory. Okay, is it ideological or not? Okay, so according to Jürgen Habermas, communicative action and fruitful dialogue among citizens is made possible by the existence of certain limits. These are the common assumptions a political community shares that enable dialogue to get off the ground in the first place with the aim of possible consensus. So in order to figure out whether any particular military engagement is justified based on fulfilling these conditions, Habermas says everybody that might be relevantly affected by taking a military action to resolve a political problem, they have to be part of the dialogue. So what I'm arguing for today is that the fact that veterans aren't playing a more important role in that dialogue is a serious threat to democracy, to understand what it takes to have genuine communicative action. Everybody's got to be talking about it. Okay. Habermas argues that communicative action, everybody talking about what action needs to be taken in regard to a certain problem, it takes place within a life world, our worldview, that remains at the backs of the participants in communication. It's present to them only in a pre-reflective form of taken for granted background assumptions. So we're making certain assumptions about just war theory that remain unchallenged. That suggests just war theory operates ideologically. Okay, he says it's an implicit knowledge that cannot be represented in a finite number of propositions. It's a holistically structured knowledge, the basic elements of which intrinsically define one another, and it's a knowledge that does not stand at our disposition to challenge, inasmuch we cannot make it conscious and place it in doubt as we please. So the assumptions that we're making in our basic worldview, the worldview that many of us share in Western democracy, many of these assumptions remain operative until new facts challenge them. Okay. Habermas contends that in addition to being grounded in shared life world assumptions, communicative action is able to approach consensus because we share certain assumptions about rational argumentation that enables us to take a different perspective on and a different evaluation of our own needs in this dialogue, if and when we hear the interpretations of the needs others have with respect to the issue at hand. He assumes that when we are engaged in dialogue about public policy issues, we're open-minded enough to be persuaded by the force of the best argument, the one which has the strongest support for the existence of a particular set of most weighty needs. Okay, so if the idea that there could be a just war, that there could be a war that fulfills all the conditions, that's what I'm going to call warism. The idea that warism functions ideologically in our American culture, on one view, depends on whether there can ever be any facts that challenge the worldview. And if there can never be facts sufficient to outweigh or challenge the worldview, that's what I'm calling ideological. Okay, Marilyn Frye from Michigan State gives a good example of what I'm trying to get at. She distinguishes primitive racism or primitive sexism. If you hold racism or sexism in such a way that no fact can dispute your basic view that women are inferior or that certain races are inferior, you're holding that view ideologically. Okay, so if you see a great female basketball player and you believe women can't play basketball, what are you going to say about that woman? She's not really a woman. Whatever that means. I'm not saying I know what that means, but that's what somebody would say. Or if they held a view such that they don't believe gravity exists, and they see somebody drop from the 34th story building and that person dies, that doesn't contradict their view that there's no such thing as gravity. They would say you hallucinated that. That's not real. Okay, so that's where I'm going at. One interpretation of holding a view ideologically means it's unfalsifiable. There's no facts that could falsify it. That's one symptom or one way to look at ideological thinking. So, if we're trying to figure out, is just warism, the view that there could be a just war, is that operating ideologically in our culture? You have to discuss whether it can be proven false when challenged by facts. For example, about the real objectives of a particular military engagement, or about whether or not the objectives have been fulfilled. So, for example, with regard to the current military occupations in Afghanistan, Iran, facts showing that the occupations have not stemmed the rise and proliferation of Al-Qaeda or any of the terrorist movements, ISIS, anything else going on in terms of terrorism in those countries. Okay, the facts say the Taliban are going to take over Afghanistan, or ISIS is going to take over a particular area of Syria, whatever. But whatever happens, you still hold the view that the war is justified. The facts can't falsify the view. Okay, here's another way that you can think about whether just warism operates ideologically. When there's unclear language, and it's used to obfuscate the reality of mission success, or make it impossible to assess whether the mission or the broader goals of the war have been achieved. Example, former Homeland Security Advisor Francis Fragos Townsend's response in a CNN interview about whether or not Osama bin Laden had been located yet. He said, "It's a success that hasn't happened yet. I don't know that I view that as a failure." Okay, obfuscation, double speak. And consider the problems with former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's response on the lack of evidence regarding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Simply because you do not have evidence that something does exist does not mean that you have evidence that it doesn't exist. So, ideological thinking, because he didn't bring in the facts. There's no facts. Okay. And ideological thinking from a Marxist perspective, I'm really not going there today. I want to talk about some other ideological perspective. But if you're looking at whether just warism functions ideologically from a Marxist perspective, that would mean that there's a rationalization of the military engagement. That means whatever the leaders are saying is not the real reason why they're there. So the rationalization functions to justify it, but it's a rationalization. It's not a real justification. And you know that, okay, the Marxist analysis, you know that there are objectives and functions that are being served that have little to do with achieving justice or democracy in the areas of military occupation. Red flag, ideology. Okay, but viewing the issue of just warism from the perspective of Habermas's theory of the life world, it's unconscious, we don't really challenge it. It results in a slightly different perspective from taking a Marxist perspective on ideology, because of Habermas's emphasis on a couple things. The belief's relationship to other fundamental beliefs. I'm going to talk about the belief's relationship to other beliefs that we hold without really challenging. They're all of a piece. And the conceptual and logical difficulties involved in articulating the assumptions may operate on an unconscious level. Okay, so if that's the way we want to look at ideology, the hypothesis of just warism is bound up with several beliefs that remain largely unchallenged in our culture. In particular, that self-defense requires the use of force, either the direct application of physical violence or weaponry, or the threat of using these as a deterrent to potential lethal aggression. This in turn, I'm getting at the assumption, unconscious assumption or not, this in turn implies that such deterrence or defense cannot be accomplished, at least in the short run, by the power of moral integrity, or exemplified by one's fidelity to one's commitments, for example, to regional or international associations or agreements, a moral commitment to honesty, or the courage to speak forthrightly and clearly about one's actions, goals, and commitment. So these views about the military versus the moral power, their effectiveness as a deterrent to war in a state of nature. Okay. The assumption is the international community is a state of nature. It's a Hobbesian assumption. This comes from Thomas Hobbes. Okay. We're in a state of nature with regard to the international community because there is no absolute executive to enforce power. There's nobody in authority to enforce norms. So, given that, we're in a state of nature. Okay, so we're making assumptions here. I'm talking about the assumptions that are at the back of our light bill. Okay, so these views about military versus moral power's effectiveness as a deterrent to war in a state of nature, including where we're at, the states comprising the international community vis-a-vis one another, have functioned in our Western life world in the unquestioned legitimacy of the Hobbesian social contract. Here it is. A single, absolute, unquestioned political leader is viewed as the only solution to the problem of the status of the international community being that of a state of nature, and therefore a state of war. In the U.S., although it is Congress's prerogative to declare war, this has been interpreted to mean that its role is to formally announce a military engagement that has already been decided upon by the President. Hobbes argues that without such an absolute executive, disagreements will result over particular policy decisions, thereby putting the political community in a state of nature, which is also a state of war, when that kind of disagreement occurs. Historical figures such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Aung San Suu Kyi get international respect and idealization, but they're rarely called on to lead the international community to solve problems in that community nonviolent. So when Hobbes and contemporary writers agree that the person who's authorized to declare war must be strong enough to muster consent by the public, they're referring to their power to produce consent and acquiescence, not moral influence. Hobbes argues for the absolute sovereign's right to determine not only which battles are worth fighting, but also to have the authority to determine what's right and wrong, just and unjust. Furthermore, Hobbes argued that the unanimity required by the urgency of such decisions can only be achieved through the mechanism of the absolute executive. Given that this version of the Hobbesian social contract still operates today, albeit tacitly in many nation states, it's not surprising that so little discussion occurs in the public sphere in the U.S. regarding the morality of our particular military engagements. Our acceptance of an increasingly powerful executive regarding the conduct of the military is an essential feature of our tacit acceptance of just warism. Hobbes' own conflation of what's rational to do in a state of nature with what's morally justified to do in a state of nature is instructive here. Several reasons can be given for the claim that the acceptance of the possibility of a just war functions as a life world unchallenged assumption, as well as ideologically in ours and most societies. Katie's analysis supports this view in his claim that there's no dialogue about just war issues in our society. He argues that common objectives to pacifism are posed in the form of a claim that anyone who would take an absolute stance against war must be naive, foolish, even dangerous. Do I look that scary? Although Katie argues that this type of objection is logically irrelevant, that's the fallacy of personal attack, his argument supports the idea that one's stance on the validity of just war theory functions as a means of separating the rational from the irrational citizen. So although this attack can be dismissed as obviously fallacious, its frequency and persuasive power play an important role in setting limits to genuine dialogue as grounded in canons of rationality. Even the discussion of other political issues, arguments, or agendas can get short shrift when the validity of a particular existing military engagement is under fire. From a Marxist perspective, political leadership could be viewed as holding its citizenry hostage to concerns about self-defense in the face of international aggression, rather than to respond to citizens' other concerns, unemployment, quality of life issues, etc. One could be viewed as irrational for focusing on something like global warming, universal medical care, when we're at war in two very incendiary places. We also hold certain life world assumptions in our Western democratic culture worth noting here about human worth and dignity. These function as the foundation of our constitutional body of law dealing with our civil and political rights. Although constitutional jurisprudence is filled with controversial discussions of the actual rights of persons due to their moral worth and dignity, no such dialogue has emerged in our public sphere about whether sending troops into dangerous and traumatizing battle zones and yet to be morally justified military engagements violates their basic dignity and intrinsic value. Yet the statistics indicating that between 1/5 and 1/4 of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans return to the U.S. with serious cases of PTSD. This suggests that having one's psyche and brain so radically and negatively altered by combat experience is tantamount to an endangerment or destruction of their moral personality and personal dignity. A reductionistic Marxist perspective on the astonishing way in which the U.S. Veterans Administration has consistently denied seriously injured and psychologically maimed vets the basic medical and psychological and disability benefits they deserve, given that the combat experience had a causal role in producing many of their injuries. If you look at that from a Marxist perspective, well, that would explain the government's attempt to refuse to engage in a dialogue about whether or not benefits are deserved is based solely on the obvious financial and political benefits for the ruling economic class. Instead, I'm suggesting that a dialogue regarding how refusing genuine claims of disability is a violation of veterans' rights as bearers of human dignity could result in questioning the basic assumption of one version of just war theory, namely that putting combatants in the role of fighting wars of yet undetermined moral value is not a denial of their moral worth and value. And as argued above, the proverbial well is poisoned against anyone who questions a particular war's legitimacy by the claim that it's irrational to question the validity of just warism. Just warism as a life-world assumption is further demonstrated by this separation of the rational, those who agree war could be justified in principle, and the irrational, those who claim it never has been justified as a matter of fact or principle and never will be. Where there exists disagreement about what's rational versus irrational, this constitutes a fundamental challenge to existing norms of rationality and irrationality, upon which agreement is essential to communicative action. Norms of rationality are the paradigms of life-world assumptions, because ethical argument and communicative action couldn't occur without agreement about what's rational. And because of their centrality to one's ability to communicate, and therefore to one's physical survival and psychological flourishing, norms about rationality occupy a portion of sacred ground upon which a person is hesitant to subject to critical evaluation. Yet the conception of rationality that the pacifist critics are arguing for relies on assumptions that comprise their political theory and is strongly grounded in Hobbesian social contract theory. Given the disorienting impact in a society engaged in a reconsideration of what rationality requires, it would seem to qualify as a likely example of Habermas's life-world assumptions. Okay. Once this claim about rationality requiring an unlimited executive has been asserted, the empirical issue of whether the particular conditions for a just war have been met becomes moot, because not necessarily the basis for the absolute leader's decision. Not only is its ideological status supported by its apparent unfalsifiability, its functioning ideologically as interpreted by Marxist theory can be revealed in the well-known economic benefits the conducting of war provides to the capitalist enterprise. In addition, the possibility of total war, I'm talking about nuclear war, functions to dismiss objections to a particular administration's call to arms based on its rationalization as a deterrent to other nations' use of their nuclear weapons. Once again, it's viewed as irrational to ignore claims that a given military threat or actual military engagement is essential to staving off nuclear war, given that in absence of realistic predictions as to the specific conditions that might provoke a nuclear state to use nuclear weapons, rationality calls for opting for the maximum strategy. Yet that the appeal to the maximum avoid the worst outcome, nuclear war. Yet that the appeal to the maximum strategy calls for military engagement, in turn is predicated on questionable factual assumptions about deterrence, including deterring irrational political actors, about the probability of military success, about unintended consequences, and about cultural responses to military occupation. North Korean society's hatred of the U.S. is based on their government's indoctrination, based on the damage and deaths resulting from American military forces during the Korean War. So they're led by a megalomaniac sociopath. So predictions about what will deter a megalomaniac sociopath, we don't have a lot of factual backup for. Given that it's obvious that a nuclear attack is the worst case scenario that must be avoided, and given the absence of probabilities about its occurring based on the past, nations must rely either on the educated guesses of academia or of those in the Pentagon, given the classified or unobtainable nature of the state of conventional and nuclear weapons held worldwide. Yet this state of affairs violates the conditions of justified ethical policy making from the perspective of Habermas's theory of community action, which would seem to call for a national dialogue. In addition, the existence of non-rational extremist actors with possible access to nuclear material and weapons provides an additional basis for U.S. citizens to question the validity of scenarios regarding the possible outcomes of nations conducting conventional or nuclear wars as justified by the military experts. In essence, we're relying on a cadre of experts in the Pentagon for giving the executive advice on policies for dealing with other nuclear powers. But although they may have a great deal of knowledge about previous military successes and failures, it's not obvious that they've been experts on the history, culture, and worldview of the nations which currently possess nuclear capability, all of which are relevant to the issue of cost-benefit analysis regarding a particular military engagement with nuclear power.
Oh my goodness. That's my favorite book. Do you like this book? Do you want this book? We can read this book every day.
Oh, that's a good read.
As a bulldozer clears the way. Our building project is almost done. We worked very hard together. So can you tell me where I just read?
I know it's weird. Am I later today? I can come back later.
What can you say? Is there something you can say to welcome someone?
That's a great idea. So if I reach out my hand and say hello, is it easy to forgive somebody or is it sometimes hard? Sometimes it's really hard. It takes a lot of patience. So we're going to plant some seeds of forgiveness. I got 4 cups and then cover it up. And then you take that pot home and you water it. Thank you.
Oh, you need your sticker, don't you?
You on the eye?
All right, let's put this right here.
All right.
You need to go, and then you can decorate it.
Hello. Like the watermelon, that's healthy.
Oh, yeah, right.
Hey, one more thing before you guys go. Okay.
Couldn't stay longer.
You guys swear that you guys always gonna try to be peaceful? Yeah. Just sign in here. That's right.
So, the second part of my talk talks about the combatant role confusion. So, I want to talk about John Glenn Gray's analysis of the psychology of men in battle. And talk about 5 things that happen to combatants in battle. And these are 5 factors that contribute to the soldier's state of moral conflict, moral confusion, and exasperation. And finally, moral insight and clarity for some, but for others, moral degradation and cynicism. Okay, the recognition that everyone around him or her depends on him or her for protection and views him as a center of force, a means of security and survival. His moods and dispositions are affected by the presence of others in the encompassing environment of threat and fear. He must surrender in a measure to the will of others and to superior force. Number 2, the acknowledgement that one has taken an oath requiring him to obey as essential to maintaining one's positions and succeeding in one's tactics in the midst of chaos, confusion, extreme fatigue, hunger, and boredom. The finding of oneself in situations in which no matter what choice is made with regard to one's options, the results of any choice will seriously endanger those around them. The frequent occurrence of a disconnect between mandates of the superior officers who issue the orders and the reality on the battlefield. And lastly, the recognition that in certain situations, if you follow clearly illegal and immoral orders, you will have crossed a line with regard to losing one's moral center and integrity. So, he interprets the guilt on the part of combatants, his study is World War II, as a result of soldiers looking inside themselves and recognizing that although their options and voluntary choices may be extremely limited, for example, disobeying orders can result in arrest, detention, and in some military forces, torture or execution. Okay, so those are his options, but he might feel guilty because he could have done better if he registered his moral repugnance with the orders. Whether this would be sufficient to rectify the soldier's action will be discussed. Gray's description and analysis of a soldier's moral conflict resulting in either demoralization or conversion includes several points about personal guilt and blame and several points about collective responsibility. And these are most clearly articulated in his concluding chapter on the future of war versus genuine peace. The state of genuine peace implies the absence of states of preparedness for future military engagements. Given the insidious seeming intractable hold warism has in our culture, he claims it would require the dynamism of an institution with as strong of a hold on our collective conscience as just warism currently does. He further claims that 2 particular psychological dispositions or propensities keep us tied to the military defense system: fear and hatred. Furthermore, he attributes war making as part of our nature as humans, apparently in agreement with Freud on this issue. In addition, he cites as basic human desires the desires for adventure, excitement, spectacle, self-sacrifice for the sake of the community, and in general, the emotional surges and excesses that war brings to your life. Yet, he leaves open the issue of what such institutions, such peacemaking institutions, might be. Obvious candidates for such a role would seem to include national community service programs, which could provide opportunities for service to the local, national, or international community, and which would provide challenges and opportunities for those who are struggling with issues of meaning and personal identity. My research on veterans' motivations suggested many of them are joining up for purposes of holding up the family tradition, but others are struggling to find meaning and identity, and given our norms about masculinity and courage, they want to prove that they are up to snuff as far as success in a military institution. Okay, another institutional suggestion: if our religious institutions would eschew warism, and which would articulate virtues of forgiveness, tolerance, compassion, and in large sense of community, and most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, courage, which is not tied to risking one's life in combat. Educational institutions, which would provide a critique of the masculinist interpretations of certain virtues such as courage, and of the mindset of combat, and which would offer challenges to the assumptions of history texts and choices regarding curriculum, regarding the inevitable necessity of war and cycles of retribution and revenge. And finally, supports for parenting, which would provide alternative models of courage, self-sacrifice, and adventure for the sake of the community. Given that parenting is an essential element in developing moral integrity and personal identity, it could play a necessary role in criticizing those idealized depictions of soldiering, which could result in putting their children in danger of losing their moral center if they enlist and are deployed in combat. None of the roles occupied in the above-mentioned institutions are likely to place its actors in a situation which would compromise their integrity, let alone put them in a dangerous position of losing one's moral center entirely. Despite the value of Gray's analysis of guilt among soldiers in combat during World War II, he ignores several issues central to a discussion of collective blame and responsibility. First, given what he considers the universal self-destructive nature of fear and hatred, he never points out how the role of combatant is articulated by military institutions and internalized in the forms of intense fear and often absolute hatred, defined by Gray as hatred that exists without awareness of the concrete circumstances of the despised enemy. It would seem that most soldiers go into combat without a clear, accurate perspective on the cultural, economic, social, and political circumstances of their enemies in combat. Further, the moral implications of the resulting state with regard to the changed cultural and moral understandings of traumatized veterans rarely reaches the level of conscious awareness in our collective conscience, even if and when it ever reaches the level of public discussion. So ultimately, I'm arguing we need veterans to speak in public dialogue about their experience. Okay. Now, other thing that I thought interesting, Gray mentions that in order to attain a collective psychological conversion to genuine peace, a strong leader would be required to enable this transformation to occur. This is because even though a political leader himself could be open to eliminating militarism, this leader would not be psychologically strong enough to succeed in his role as a Hobbesian ultimate bodyguard. Yet this assumption about the head of state's primary role as defender is itself question-begging, given that it functions at the same level and the same power as the unquestioned nature of warism, because it assumes such a strong leader would believe his only choices are keep military forces as they presently operate and use them when perceived as necessary for tamping down fear, sake of security tamping down fear, or eliminate the military forces and use reasoning and regional and or international alliances and agreements to tamp down fear and hatred. Neither one of these options, as stated, includes a description of the further problem of the immoral and potentially self-destructive role into which government and military leaders place combat troops for the sake of reducing fear in those who will not enter the military. Consequently, because the assumptions regarding what is necessary for waging a successful war regarding soldiers' mindsets, loyalty, obedience, etc., themselves go unchallenged as a result of the ideological nature of just war theory, a militarized society must be held responsible for the predictable self-destruction, demoralization, or psychological conversion that can be known to occur. Despite the authority of Gray's analysis about the psyche of the soldiers fighting in World War II, there's a surprising dearth of discussion of the special moral role of veterans in bringing their moral narrative to bear on the discussions in the public sphere regarding the legitimacy of ongoing military solutions to political problems. For example, he says one possible outcome of a soldier's experiencing actions that violate all possible aspects of a person's dignity and value is that of hatred for humanity in general. He argues that witnessing the execution of hostages, torturing of prisoners of war, and the mass murder of civilians and the liberation of villages can thwart permanently the sense that human nature has any redeeming features. Alternatively, refusing to participate in such inhumane, horrific actions can alienate one's comrades and deprive the soldier of the only moral support and interactions with humanity essential to psychological survival in battle. But a soldier's critical evaluation of his morally problematic battlefield experiences and insights fail to consider whether the role that veterans and soldiers must play is immoral or evil, although he documents many cases in which playing this role can cost a soldier his moral personality and integrity. His test case is World War II, which many would argue is the only just war occurring in recent times, given the horrors of Nazism had to be stopped. Yet he argues that once a soldier becomes a part of a battlefield unit, whatever views that person had about the justice of the military conflict, or about the possibility of bringing about a successful military outcome using certain specific tactics, the only goal soldiers aim for is winning the war while saving the lives of his comrades. The same holds true for many enlistees' motivations for signing up for military duty. Desires to keep up a family military tradition, finding personal meaning in an otherwise mundane life, providing service to one's country. It soon becomes apparent that their main objective is to win the war, whether or not this produces justice. And this is accomplished by sticking to the mission's objectives, more narrowly specified. Gray claims that if one's mission isn't clearly articulated, soldiers may fail to adopt the role of soldier, willing to sacrifice his life for the sake of his comrades in arms. Yet narratives about combat in Iraq and Afghanistan reveal real problems with the relationship between questionable orders and mission success. Nowhere does he mention that if and when a soldier realizes he's not fighting a just war, the soldier will become demoralized and may decide for that reason to forsake his comrades. This is because regardless of the original mission and broadest objectives to be fulfilled by the war, soldiers come to realize that their sole duty is to keep their comrades and themselves alive. But this is stated and maintained throughout the book without asking whether self-sacrifice is warranted in the course of fighting an unjust war. His response to moral arguments that self-sacrifice might be better understood as an evil is that the basis of these moralist criticisms of self-sacrifice is that it may be an impulse not subject to rational judgment and control. He doesn't address the further question of whether the moral value of self-sacrifice must be assessed in light of the avowed goals of the mission. And so to the extent that the war is not morally justified, the value of self-sacrifice would be compromised or eliminated. In essence, I'm arguing here that the role of a soldier as a vital element in achieving justice and ultimately peace through conventional warfare has been replaced in recent wars by the role of soldier as contractual bodyguards and killers essential to saving as many lives of one's countrymen as possible. So rather than explicating the transition from the avowed original role as perceived justice to the subsequent one as realizing combat, Gray's focus is primarily on the moral transformation involved when one realizes that the actions one is required to take are blameworthy. The prior philosophical question of whether it's an immoral role to be put in or to accept is not closed. Another aspect of role confusion in his experience in combat in Italy and France is revealed in the emotional and psychological changes that combat troops there endured when they were dealing with civilian populations in these countries. He argues that American soldiers regularly switch from cruelty and barbarism towards some collaborators to love, tenderness, and compassion towards others within a time frame of only moments. He explains these moral lapses as due to the occupying of the role of a functionary, which he analyzes as due to cowardice, when the role enactment involves closing one's eyes to their freedom and responsibility to act morally. In his discussion of the atrocities committed by the Nazis and fascists during World War II, he claims they were all errant cowards who say they were forced to do what they did. I'm tempted to think that the key to the whole rotten mess, the occurrences during World War II, is lack of courage and presence of fear. Cowards best understand the psychology of fear. but he minimizes the moral degradation that must have occurred when those committed horrific acts of abuse, when he concludes, being a functionary is not entirely foreign to the nature of the majority of us. The transition from one's original motivations for participating in combat for reasons of personal meaning and identity in the fulfillment of one's country's broader justified military and political goals to that of keeping those in your unit alive is explained by Gray in his claim that there occurs a transcendence of the self when soldiers experience a merging of the self with that of the group. Readiness to die for the sake of saving others is explained by Gray as resulting from transcending the moral self and identifying with a heroic, immortal self who survives death. What's missing in this analysis of a soldier's psychology in combat is the issue of whether these motivations to experience the sublime are affected at all by the recognition that the war being fought is not morally justified after all. Although he reports the experience of recognizing that the enemy soldiers may be no more guilty or evil than oneself, given what we know about the banality of evil, that's I think what he's relying on when he talks about functionaries. He doesn't explain how a person can enjoy an expansion of the self in a mystical union with others in one's unit if one no longer believes in the justice of the cause he's fighting. It's as if the issue of it being a just military engagement loses its urgency as well as its meaning, and focusing on this issue becomes a real disvalue once survival issues take over. Gray does not examine the possibility that one's role and purpose in combat might be viewed as analogous to a mercenary or hired killer for purposes of aggrandizing power, property, money, or other self-serving national motives. And as such, the achievement of the transcendent expansion into the sublime, when such achievement presupposes a commitment to ends higher and greater than those of the individual self, would therefore be sacrificed. So I don't think a fair word is fast forwarding given how long I've been talking. So I'm going to reach a conclusion. The morality of the combat role, construction, and acceptance. Is there a moral difference between accepting the role of combatant in order to fight an unjust war or a just war? Most enlisted soldiers believe that if they're deployed to combat duty, they're fulfilling a moral duty to protect their country and leave it up to the Pentagon and chief executive to determine which battles are morally worth fighting. It's only later, when thrust into the chaos, confusion, trauma, possibly illegality of battle, that the questions of whether the war is justified or whether the mission they're engaged in is justified typically arise. We can compare the excuse of mistake as it functions in these cases with the possible self-deception one might engage in when involved in a much more blatantly unjustified organization. I'm not saying, the army is like this. Assassins working for drug cartels. I accepted the role, I got to do the job. The American or Italian mafia, hitmen available for personal vendettas or insurance money. What I'm arguing for here is the ideological function of just warism that enables the self-deception of combatants with regard to the moral status of their own acts of killing. Unconscious or ideologically held life-world assumptions about the inevitability of our country seeking military solutions to other countries' political problems are misguided and serve only to maintain global hegemony, yet at the same time make it very difficult to engage in fruitful communicative action regarding the justification of any specific military engagement. So what I've tried to document here with my research on combatant role confusion, what I'm trying to document is the moral confusion and psychological suffering endured by combatants when they become apprised of the moral issues brought to the fore in combat. Yet there's another broader ethical question that worries us as well, and that's our own collective responsibility for sustaining the role of combatant as a worthy ethical choice for our young citizens. As Plato argued in the Republic, designing social productive institutions to accomplish one's society's minimal requirements must also make it possible for citizens to carry out their role responsibilities in such a way that promotes their virtue. That's Plato. The soldier-warrior archetype is extolled in that text, The Republic, when it's carried out virtuously, with courage, self-discipline, integrity, and with the view to fighting worthwhile, risk-beneficial wars. He also claims that censorship is required to produce such states of courage in battle. Stories about soldiers losing it in battle are prohibited. Ultimately, this proviso can be viewed as a concession to the need for intensive socialization prior to deployment. Yet becoming a combatant in extremely dangerous, traumatizing, yet morally or military questionable circumstances is not the sole or even the best option for developing these virtues in the warrior in the service of justice. Plato has characterizing risk-taking in combat as foolhardy if the war itself isn't justified. We can surmise then that the devolution of courageous hero to chump for the sake of questionable political goals is a stance with which Plato would concur. A more expansive conception of courage is needed to replace the current paradigm as tied to taking serious risks for the sake of political or military goals. In conclusion, the combatant role confusion and conflict I described here has one of its jointly sufficient conditions: the social construction of the courageous, altruistic, heroic combatant role that's radically out of sync with the lived experience of a highly trained mercenary who can't break his or her contract with the armed forces without further endangering his fellow combatants or his own fragile, morally challenged identity. And as stated above, I am arguing for a more extensive, nationwide Habermasian dialogue regarding the basic life world assumptions we have about just warism, as well as about alternatives for virtuous national service outside the military paradigm. Thank you for how well you focused on this paper. It's unbelievable. They should have videotaped you. I've never had a philosophy audience this attentive. I don't know why, and it's at night. I don't know if it's in the coffee, but I see students' eyes glazing over. I haven't seen that here yet. I hope it doesn't happen to John.
Thank you.
I can't believe how well you